Welcome to Co-Opinions. This is Indie Thoughts, the segment where we talk to developers from smaller studios to get their perspective. Today, we have Greg Kasavin from Supergiant Games on.
Well, first and foremost, thank you tremendously for coming on. I really can't tell you how much this means to me.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me. We've been chatting for a while, so it's good to finally be able to meet quasi face to face.
I know I appreciate it. So if you don't mind, we don't have a ton of time because I could talk about everything you've done for hours. So I need to get a lot into a little amount of time.
Sure.
So let's start with your background prior to Supergiant Games because I think it influences a lot of what you've done at Supergiant Games. I see that in the mid-90s you started up a website, Arcadia Magazine.
Yeah.
And you ran that for about a year?
Yeah, that's right. Even before that, I started writing about games in my senior year of high school because I was just playing games so much. They were such a big part of my life from my earliest memory that there came a point where I felt like I just had to do something with it, in part to, justify the habit to myself, as it were, and, kind of keep my parents from shooting me too many dirty looks. So I tried my hand at like programming and stuff like that on a number of occasions, and I kind of like bashed my head against it. It didn't really stick with me, but writing was something I always really enjoyed, in addition to playing games. So I started working on a little fanzine, which back in the 90s were actually printed on paper and sent in the mail, which sounds positively prehistoric right now, but that it was like just a thing I was doing for fun with someone I met on the kind of proto internet at that time. But one thing kind of led to another, and soon enough I was getting these. I got some writing gigs at actual like gaming publications. And the first place I worked was called New Type Gaming Monthly. And then I left New Type with a couple of my colleagues from there. We started our own little website, called Arcadia. And then about a year later, we had some. It was kind of like it was a really good learning experience and a lot of fun, but it was like, I don't know that we were that serious about it kind of turning into a real thing. And I instead that was right when a website called GameSpot launched in 1996, and I was very lucky that they turned out to be in San Francisco just like I was. So I just kind of reached out to them at one point and said, hey, I also run a gaming website. Anyway, it led to an internship. And then I ended up working at GameSpot for more than 10 years, starting as an intern, and I was editor-in-chief at the end. So I spent more than 12 years in total in the gaming press, and really fell in love with that kind of work, like game criticism. But I never lost sight of wanting to develop games also. So, yeah.
And that informed your move to EA at that point, correct?
Yeah, that was in 2007. So it was like a little over 10 years after I started at GameSpot, and that was one of those things where, I probably in the 6 months leading up to that, I started really feeling some kind of I really felt that the 10 years had just disappeared in a flash, and if I never tried my hand at game development, I might never get a chance, because it's a young industry. You don't get a lot of shots at it necessarily. So a former colleague of mine who I worked with at GameSpot, he knew I wanted to work on games one day as well. He told me about an opening that they had for a producer at Electronic Arts in Los Angeles on the Command and Conquer team, making real-time strategy games, and I was a big fan of that series among others. So I applied for it and got it, and that's when I made the switch and kind of got on the current path that I'm on now. So that certainly had its, game development has been its own roller coaster ride for sure. But it's been very rewarding to have been able to finally do the work after all these years of kind of wanting to do it since I was a little kid.
I would imagine that would be incredibly gratifying, and I mean, I can respect wanting to make that transition. I know that my push in this way was the same thing I wanted to creatively contribute in a way that I could. So, however, while you were at EA, would I be correct in assuming that's where you met future Supergiant co-founders Gavin and Amir?
Yeah, that's right. I think I probably met both of them on my very first day or soon after. So they were, the first game I worked on was Command and Conquer 3.
Mm-hmm.
And Amir, who's our studio director at Supergiant, he was a designer, like creating like campaign missions.
Mm-hmm.
And he had just started. So I started in January. I believe he started in around October of the previous year. So he preceded me by a few months. It's funny when you're new at an organization, you can't tell who's been there like forever and who's been there. And so I was later surprised. I'm like, oh, you were only there since October? You felt like you gave me the impression that you were an old pro there. But Gavin was like an AI, like an artificial intelligence designer / programmer, and he had been he goes way back because he started like working as a tester on some of the old like on I think on like Yuri's Revenge or something like that when he was in his teens. So he had been working on Command and Conquer for a good long time already, even though he was like a young guy. In his early 20s, you'd think he would have been new to the industry, but he'd been working on Command and Conquer for a while. We worked together for several projects, Command and Conquer 3, and then Red Alert 3, and its expansion pack. And then we started on a project that was never announced and was canceled along the way, but we worked closely on pre-production on that. And then it was in the summer of 2009 that we all kind of left one after another. And Amir and Gavin, moved into Amir's dad's house and started Supergiant, and I went to go work at 2K Games and would end up joining with them about a year later, much to my, life takes strange turns. I didn't necessarily think that it would turn out that way, but I'm certainly glad it did, because that gave me the opportunity to do the kind of work that I do now. That has been so rewarding, certainly at its best. Yeah, so we were all, back in 2009. It feels like it's 10 years ago, but that was when it was an important time for independent games, because there were these games like Braid. The ones that really stood out to us at the time were games like Braid and Castle Crashers and Plants vs. Zombies and World of Goo. And all these games, they're still amazing games now, actually, if you pick them up. But they, even back then, or especially back then, they were so different, but they each made such a strong impression around how like a small number of people could have put together something that felt so personal and so kind of well crafted, because I think there was an expectation around then in the game industry that, to make something great, you need a lot of people, because that's kind of where things were going with AAA games. Right. So the fact that small groups of people could make games that were so good was really inspiring. So being inspired by games like that, and from our experience working together at Electronic Arts, that led to some of the foundational kind of thought process behind the kind of stuff we do at Supergiant, and also just wanting to make the kind of games that we had in our heads that we wouldn't necessarily get a chance to make in a bigger studio environment.
Right. And while I did play Castle Crashers and Braid and all that, Bastion was one of the games that, like you said, when it was announced headlining the Summer of Play in 2011, it blew me away how this game looked and how it played. So when I found out after the fact that your studio was very, very small at the time, it fascinated me that something so impactful could be made by such a small team. And it really jumped out at me how significant everybody's role had to be because of that. For example, the art direction is one of the things. Even that it's been 8 years since Bastion came out, and it's still a good-looking game. Like, that is a testament to both the design and the colors. It's a much brighter visual apocalypse than you're used to.
Yeah.
So, and there were just some things about it, like how the music so tightly integrated into it. And I know that you have some hand in the music cues as they tie into the story. Would you mind expanding a little bit more on what your thought process is in that?
Yeah, I think for sure the music, the music and the audio of our games has been one of our not so secret weapons ever since Bastion. Bastion of
Yes.
course starts with the narration, but I think the music um, is really responsible for some of the big kind of the heavy hitting punches that game has, such as it does. The music puts a lot of weight behind those, and that's thanks to our composer and audio director Darren
Hmm.
Korb. Um, the ability to work to like collaborate with him so closely, having someone like him be there from the start of the project, so we can really work the music uh, into the design and into the story. I think in addition to his talent as a composer and a musician, it's what really lets the music do its work, that we know the potential that it has, and we just try to give it the time and recognize it as a really vital part of the experience of our games. So yeah, I just I spend a lot at my role involves both design and writing. So I do the writing for our games and come up with the aspects of the world and the characters and so on, what the whole story arc is going to be. And I can't help but think of the music as an intrinsic part of that,
Hmm.
because when there are going to be these significant moments in the game, like it's all about how are these moments going to make somebody feel. So
Hmm.
how can I not think about the audio as part of that? And so being able to collaborate with Darren has really been one of the great pleasures for me of working at Supergiant, actually. And like, even we were, to this day we still like do a lot of things kind of the same way we always have. Even today we were just recording with Logan, who is the
Hmm.
voice of Bastion's narrator and been our principal actor in every one of our games. And it's just, I think having folks with that much talent involved from the start, instead of just like, I think it can happen on games where they might commission a really talented composer to work on their music, but if they do that too late in the process, they're going to drop some music into their game and it's going to sound great, but they won't have given it the time for it to be like an integral part of the experience,
Hmm.
in a way that we're just like working with the music and how it affects the gameplay, how it interacts with the gameplay, like from our early prototyping in each of our games. So hopefully, I don't think that guarantees anything at all, but I think it helps. It helps make it possible for the music and audio in the game to have a big impact.
Hmm. It seems like it allows the game to grow together because, like you said, some of the most impactful moments from Bastion in particular, and this is when I knew that I had to get some version of the soundtrack, would be the first time that you meet the singer.
Yeah.
And I think that was intentional because that was a haunting song. And even now, it's one of my favorite songs on that soundtrack.
Thank
That
you.
being said, I think I have a digital version, two physical CDs, and two vinyls, one signed and one unsigned, just because I have tried to do everything I can to support you guys just
Thank you.
because of how much of an impact this has had. But one thing that I found interesting while I was doing the research is that you guys brought a demo of Bastion to GDC in 2010, I believe, and I could be off base, but I think I read that it had relatively little fanfare when you showed it at GDC 2010.
It's that is accurate, though it wasn't shown in a public capacity at GDC.
Oh,
So that's it was shown to like a smaller. It was shown to select developers, so it wasn't like
gotcha.
on display. But it was still a key. It was an interesting moment for sure. So I technically wasn't on the team at that point. So that was like that was Amir and Gavin, showing kind of like the latest iteration of the art pass and the first pass of the world of the game, such as it would eventually be. Meaning, we had the first instances of Logan's narration there, and the
Mm-hmm.
kid was there. So there were earlier versions of Bastion where like the world of it was quite different, where the idea of a fully narrated adventure like that wasn't even there. That came in like January of 2010, whereas development started back in September. It wasn't even, narration wasn't even conceived of at the start, which is, I think, surprising for folks to hear because they think it's so like integral to the idea of it. But it just like at GDC, that version of the game was still, relatively incoherent. There were, though I say that in a kind, I don't mean that to sound as mean as it might have sounded, but there were still things like weird, like floating jellyfish in the sky and like all kinds of really strange stuff that we it's still a pretty weird game in a lot of ways, but we dialed it back quite a bit from that initial version. And then Gavin and Amir submitted the game to something called the PAX 10, which was a competition that, if you were selected, your game would be displayed at the Penny Arcade Expo at PAX in Seattle, and they got in. So suddenly PAX was the big opportunity, like the game's actual unveiling. So we knew about that a good few months ahead of time. So it's like, okay, this is it. This is the real chance to get this thing ready for people to check out. And that's when I bit the bullet and, convinced my wife and family that I should leave my perfectly good job at 2K and join my friends, certain to experience peril at being a small independent studio. But this game was going to be our shot, and we put it out there at the Penny Arcade Expo, and that's when it turned a lot of heads like right away, and we got a lot of interest. So it was an incredible moment for us. We did not expect the response to Bastion to be so positive so quickly. We thought that things like the narration were going to be pretty polarizing, that like half the people would be like, do I have to listen to this or whatever? But people were really enamored of it, and then gave us a lot of momentum we still had to like make basically the entire game. We had like 20 minutes of solid gameplay, but we knew where it was going, and it proved to us that people wanted us to keep doing what we were doing. So yeah, we thankfully were able to realize, I think, the potential that people saw in it then, and it wasn't like a grand slam home run like right out the gate or anything when it launched the following year, but it just really remarkably, it kept, even because you played it, it's a single player game, you finish it and you kind of move on. It's not a game designed to keep you playing for weeks and weeks, but it just kept going. People kept talking about it and they kept buying it. So suddenly, we survived our first game as a team of 7 people, and it put us in a position to make something else, which was Transistor, our second game. It took a while to make that one. Did a lot of stuff with Bastion still along the way. We brought it to a lot of new platforms and all that, but we really, starting out, I think all we wanted to do was release a game that was kind of worth a damn from our perspective, and cross our fingers, hopefully we'd get another chance to do it, but we didn't assume that we would. We thought that Bastion may very well be the last game we ever be able to make together as a team. Thankfully though, it let us carry on, and all 7 of us, we're all still here working together in our respective roles. We're closer to being, we're at about 18 people now. We actually grew a lot just in the last year, gearing up for Hades's announcement and launch just a couple of months ago. But we've stayed under 20 people. This 12 was our number through most of our years. So it's been cool to be able to do this stuff and still be, the fact that I could have a conversation with you 10 years later about our first game. I'm very grateful that it was able to have that effect on people, that it's, hasn't been forgotten.
I do think one of the things you mentioned was what a tale that Bastion's had. One of the things that I consistently tell people when I talk to them about not just Bastion, but your studio as a whole, is Bastion is the best way to introduce yourself to your development studio, because you can see a lot of the foundation for later games. For example, one of the things you said that I thought was interesting was the fact you thought the narration was going to be polarizing. And I read a few reviews where they did say that it was kind of gimmicky, which I didn't agree with because I felt that it was a punchy way to deliver the exposition without getting bogged down in the details. And it gave you a sense of immersion, even though technically, yes, there were only so many paths you could go on, but it felt like what you did made an impact in an otherwise relatively, it's a brawly game, action hack. So it was curious that you said you thought that the narration would be polarizing, because I know I saw countless parodies after that came out of what if the Bastion narrator did this, or so.
Yeah, for sure. Like, it's like story in games is one of those things where there are a lot of different points of view on what is kind of the correct or optimal way to, or there's just a lot of different preferences on what makes for good story in games. And there's some people who want like a Metal Gear Solid or like a Last of Us, kind of like a highly cinematic, tightly crafted narrative experience like that. And there are other there's the whole kind of opposite end of the narrative spectrum that's like much more about the player story. You have like the immersive sim genre, where it's all about like what is your story through this world? How do you create your character and interact with the world around you to create your story? And it's less of like it's less about the authorship of the story and more about how the systems in the world of the game let you sort of use your imagination to create a story of your own. And I kind of have a broad appreciation of story in games. I like it kind of all different ways. So I think we've just tried to find our own niche, using the resources that we have available, which are things like the amazing voice of Logan Cunningham, the fact that we know Logan. He's such a wonderful actor. If we didn't know Logan, we probably wouldn't have used a voiceover at all. So it wasn't like it wasn't that we approach things from like a problem solving standpoint. And back to Bastion, like we knew that the narrative was an opportunity for us with that game, because we wanted to make an action RPG that's games like Diablo, but not only did we feel like it was a genre that had kind of relatively underexplored having narrative as a more central part of the game. Like certainly Diablo has some story, but it's not like really a central aspect of the kind of hack and slash experience. But also as a small team, we were going to make an action RPG that would be kind of on paper really lacking, like on a feature per feature basis. Like it wasn't going to have 10 million weapons and 50 hours of game, or like hundreds of hours of gameplay and whatever 8-player multiplayer and all this kind of stuff. So how do we make this not an inferior game? Well, we could use the narrative to like make sense of the design decisions that we made and to hopefully make the player's experience through the game feel more significant in some way, add some weight to what's going on through the use of the narrative. So I really value, I enjoy a good story for its own sake, but there's also the part of me as a game developer that recognizes that narrative in games has the power to make our experiences in games feel more meaningful when it's tied well to the mechanics and to the theme. And we just really enjoy like looking for those opportunities to tie the gameplay and the narrative and the theme together. And being a small team, it actually makes it, I think, easier for us to do some of that work than it is on like a very large team when coordinating those kind of efforts. I think is like it just kind of exponentially more challenging. So yeah.
And something you said there that really jumped out at me, the mechanics tying into the plot. One of the things that I thought was really fascinating about the plot of Bastion was it seemed, and you'll definitely be able to speak to this, because it was from the perspective of a highly divisive area where you had your community versus this the other community, the Solandians versus the Ura. The narrator took the perspective of the Solandians, and you saw a very specific slant in everything he was saying.
Yeah.
And even the bad things for his country, he tried to reframe. But you could notice through the gameplay, like, for example, in the first level, if you start running at one point, sentries will start shooting you. So maybe things weren't as great as he said before the calamity happened. And it's little details like that that you draw together to have more of a picture. And you'd mentioned you weren't trying to design a game that was going to be 50 hours long, but the themes that you had in it lent itself to immediately replaying it in my mind, because thematically, the ending that I felt was appropriate the first time was the rebirth ending, because it lined up with who you were supposed to be. And then when you started up the second time and the first line is the last line, you go, maybe I did something wrong here.
Yeah, so. we had, it's cool that you picked up on all of that. We had thoughts during development that maybe the choice around the ending, that I think the way that you experienced it is in arguably like an optimal way, where the first time you play it is you get the restoration ending, and then you play it again and you choose the evacuation ending. Of course, we made it open-ended so that players can have the experience that they felt was true to themselves. But yeah, during development, we wondered if maybe it should be that the choice would only be available kind of in New Game Plus, that initially you would only be able to choose the restoration ending. We ended up not doing that for a bunch of reasons, but it's interesting that we thought that some players may well experience it that way anyway, which it sounds like you did, which is cool. And yeah, for sure, it was really exciting, like from a writing standpoint, to explore like the sort of the tradition of the unreliable narrator.
Yes.
We present the narration as an omniscient narration. It seems to be explicitly omniscient, because you don't see this guy, at least not at first, and he seems to know everything that's going on. So you're just like, oh, it's a narrator, knows everything, and people interpret it that way, of like, the voice that narrates your life. But yeah, as you play more, you as a player start to realize some of this character's biases, and even some of the gaps in his own knowledge. And I think from like a storytelling standpoint, it's just I really enjoy stories where my presence as a viewer sometimes gives me superior knowledge of certain aspects of what's going on than even the characters in the story. Like I think part of the pleasure of something like Game of Thrones or whatever is that you get this like meta awareness of the story, right? You know what the different factions are plotting against each other, and if only everybody knew what everybody else knew, they'd probably all, everything would turn out quite a bit differently. So it's fun to play with the audience's knowledge and lack of knowledge about what's going on, and have those little moments where suddenly you have like a greater awareness even than the characters in the story. Yeah, and I'm glad that worked out, and hopefully gave players reasons to come back to the game, but also reasons to keep thinking about it afterwards. So we say we want to make the kind of games that can really leave hopefully they could leave a lasting and positive impression on players. So even if they don't have 200 hours of gameplay or whatever, hopefully you'll look back on them with fondness and be like, I'm glad I played that, and that wasn't like other stuff I played, and it was worth my time. That's kind of the outcome I look for with the kind of games that we make, and I hope we can keep that up for a long time to come.
Well, it seems like your track record is favoring you right now.
Thank you.
But I would like to take this opportunity to transition on to Transistor, actually, because one of the things that jumped out at me in Bastion was, though I did enjoy the gameplay, I didn't feel that it wildly incentivized me to experiment with the different weapons. Now, when I started Transistor, I noticed that the gameplay, at first I thought I can just play this like Bastion. And then I got up to the first boss and got my skull caved in. Like, oh, this is a learning moment right here. So
yeah.
What was the thought process behind that? Because I've read some postmortems, but I'd love to hear from you about how this all tied together for you.
Yeah, for like, Transistor was us really trying to see if we can do it again after
Hmm.
making and what it is maybe hard to define, but we really liked creating like a world from scratch in
Hmm.
Bastion, and kind of creating our own set of rules that we could then kind of break over the course of the game. And Transistor was, even after making Bastion, we felt like there was so much room left to explore in that kind of like isometric hack and slash kind of genre.
Hmm.
And we were particularly interested in seeing if we could like kind of infuse it with some of the pleasures of playing turn-based strategy games, like some of the
Hmm.
drama of. It's not the strategy portion explicitly. It's more like the drama and suspense of
Hmm.
playing turn-based strategy games, where you have your moment. If you've ever played like XCOM or Advance Wars or any number, Civilization or anything like
Hmm.
that, that's turn-based. You have that end turn moment where you're like, okay, well, I'm gonna cross my fingers now and let's see what happens, because you kind
Right.
of you set up your turn. You want to see you hopefully end up in a favorable position, but then you know that your opponent is going to retaliate, and you don't know exactly how, and you don't know how screwed over you're going to be, once their turn resolves. But then you're going to have to deal with it. So we wanted to have that kind of cycle of like kind of table flipping back and forth between you and your opponents as a core part of the game, and that's what
Hmm.
lended itself to the turn system in Transistor, which is kind of the core mechanic where you stop the world around you, you plan out your next set of actions, but then afterwards you're kind of briefly vulnerable. And then the whole way of like the different functions, the system you alluded to, where you can like really experiment.
Hmm.
That was something that came about. It was like relatively later in development, after many iterations on different like ability systems, where we just really we've always favored making games that like give players the opportunity to experiment, but we
Hmm.
have to like compel them to do so also. Hopefully not force them, but make them feel comfortable and like they want to try different things. Because as game players, often you'll play a game and it'll have like 30 different weapons in it, but the first weapon you find is awesome, so you never try the other 29 or something like that. It's a bit of a shame, because there may have been really exciting play experiences if you only kind of had an opportunity to play with some of the other tools that the developers created. So Transistor was this big kind of like a sandbox of mixing and matching these different abilities, and we designed other systems that kind of nudge you into mixing up the kind of functions that you played with, to keep it, hopefully to keep the gameplay interesting, and also to play into that part of the experience where it was a world filled with a lot of mystery, and you had this kind of weapon of extraordinary origin. We wanted the
Hmm.
players to be wondering just what that thing could do all the way from the beginning to the end of the game, and feeling like they have something very powerful if only they could like fully understand it.
And that was something you said, the drive to experiment. Because, for the sake of honesty, my arc with the way this game started was I thought, oh, this is just going to be Bastion, but in a different approach.
Yeah.
This is a lot harder than Bastion. And then I realized at first I was kind of frustrated because, like you said, it took away my functions when I lost all my health. But then I
Yeah.
realized as I was progressing, it was incentivizing mixing and matching, and I found myself using all the functions far more than I ever did in Bastion using all the
Right.
weapons. So at the beginning of the game, I was just using the basic function
Yeah.
from the, and by the end of the game, I was doing these incredible chains together,
Yeah.
and it really came together because this was kind of a recurring theme for me where I start the game thinking, I'm not sure I'm going to like this as much as the first one. And by the end, I think they went a totally different direction and they nailed it on this.
That's
So,
awesome. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
oh,
For someone who, we knew that players who really, for someone who really enjoyed Bastion, like we were like, hopefully they feel that this is on the level for them, but like
mhm,
we can't necessarily replace somebody's like favorite game. We could just hopefully we'll make something that is also interesting, also worthwhile, interesting in different ways. But despite its differences, you can look back on it and see it has similar values, like what you loved. If you love Bastion, hopefully the mindset, the aspects of Bastion that you enjoyed, how the world came together, how the systems of the game interacted with each other, those kind of broader ideas, those are all things that we still really value, I think, in just the same way from each project to the next, no matter how different the game we're working on is from the last one. So we were really had no idea what people were going to say about Transistor, honestly. And over time, it's been a real relief, and again, just a source of gratitude that game has resonated with so many players over time, because it wasn't a foregone conclusion by any means that we had made something that was going to live up to how people perceived our first game, since Bastion ended up being so well regarded.
And that's what I thought was really impressive, was the fact that you didn't try to make a game that was Bastion 2, you tried to make a game that was another Supergiant game. You could tell the DNA of your company was definitely running in this. One of the things I and everybody else noticed immediately was you really leaned into the music direction. Way more Ashley Barrett involved, who is just phenomenal as a singer. And I thought that getting the music that centrally involved really showcased that you guys knew where your strengths definitely were from the first game. And I thought that was fascinating and fantastic, because, again, you made another soundtrack that as soon as I finished the game, I bought 3 different versions of the soundtrack.
Thank you. Yeah, that was one of those things where we, you referenced the Prosper Bluff moment, the Ashley's song in Bastion, and that moment was, we intended for that moment to be an exciting surprise, kind of like hopefully it had the makings of a memorable moment in that game, because you went through that game, certainly not expecting to hear another voice, let alone the beautiful voice of Ashley Barrett. That was kind of our thought process around that moment. But now, in light of that, we're like, well, we can't just do that trick again. Now people know. So it was that thought process of you know what? Let's essentially double down on this aspect. And this time, our protagonist is a singer. The music is even more central, if it could be, than in our first game. And it's exciting to even just to think about it that way, from the standpoint of wanting to. I personally, I think my colleagues as well, we really value surprising our player. Surprise is an important kind of emotional response in games. I think when we play a lot of games and we start to have that experience of I've just kind of played this before, this is the umpteenth military shooter or something like that, it's not as exciting for us as it once was, even if maybe on paper the game is better. You play the 7th installment in a series that you really enjoyed. It doesn't have quite the magic of the original, even if technically it's a better game. So we just try to surprise ourselves during development, come up with things that we haven't done before, to keep it fresh and interesting for us as a development team, and hopefully that will translate into the experience for our players once our game is out there ready to be played. But that's definitely a leap of faith, because with something like Prosper Bluff, you work on it, you spend so much time kind of working on it that a lot of the initial magic is lost on you as someone working on it over time. So you're so close to it that you have no idea really how others are going to take it. You just have your thought about how hopefully it can be received, and then through play testing and that sort of thing, you start to get an impression of whether it's working or not. But you can't, as a developer, one of the tragedies is that you can't really experience your own work the way your players can, but you're desperate to know what players are actually going to think. You're just so close to it, so you're having to find that right kind of level of detail to where you could get. You want to make sure that the work that you're doing is going to impact players, hopefully the way you hope, or in a positive way at least.
Well, and something you had just mentioned about the element of surprise in gaming being valuable. One of the things that I will concur with you on is that when I got to the first boss fight, I was expecting, because, of Red's background as a singer, there to be significantly more singing. The song for the first boss fight is one of the most memorable in the entire game, to the point where it didn't even bother me that I was getting beaten mercilessly while I was fighting her. That being said, as I continued progressing through the game, I found that a lot of the most significant moments were being accompanied by these songs. When I fought the Spine, that was accompanied by a haunting song. And the big thing that surprised me, and this is, I guess, a spoiler for anybody who hasn't played Transistor at this point, it was the final boss fight. Because you spend the entire game perfecting your ability to use this system, and that's your edge. That's your ability to take out anybody. And then when the final boss says, "I'll go first," and pauses, and that honestly made me jump, because nobody else had been able to hold a candle to me. Like, oh no, he can do my thing.
Yeah. No, that's what we were. It's funny because that was like, I'm glad that moment worked for you. That was. Our games go through lots of twists and turns during development, but the idea that Transistor would culminate in this sort of, like, we called it a showdown between we set up the whole story that the Transistor is unique, only to have you face someone with a similar set of capabilities as like the ultimate challenge in that game. That was something that was an idea that happened very early on in like a 3-year project. So I was really pleased that we were able to come around back to that and to execute it, considering how many ideas come and go during the course of development that we don't necessarily we don't even always try. Sometimes we try them, they don't work out the way we hoped. But like part of it was also that Bastion. Like there is no final boss in Bastion, which was a very, very kind of deliberate aspect of the design of that game, that it's kind of like antithetical to the experience of Bastion for there to be some sort of boss fight at the end. So for Transistor, we're like, okay, this time we're doing a boss fight, because the surprising, now people expect us to not do a boss fight, so we're going to do a boss fight. But then how do we make the boss fight interesting and surprising and suspenseful, and the idea that it'll be this table turning moment on you, came about, and it was fun to work on, and I'm glad that the character of Royce, who you face at the end, I think a lot of our players got a kick out of him, so I was glad about that as well. It was also our first time, kind of with major voice. There's some other bits of voiceover in. You talk to Zia at the end, and Bastion briefly, but Transistor had quite a bit more voiceover from actors who were not Logan Cunningham. So that was it was a big challenge for us to get actors to who can really stand up to Logan's incredible performance, and feel like they worked in the same world. And Sankrish Bala, played Royce, and I thought that did an amazing job.
Oh yeah, the delivery on all of it, and that was one of the things that really made that ending resonate, was because all of the bosses prior to that were something that were distinctly bigger than you. Even the first boss was twice your size. Then you fight the Spine, that's enormous, and then you find what you think to be the ringleader dead. And you're like, well, now what? And then that climactic fight at the end, coupled with how it ends when you defeat Royce, it's just a very somber ending with a very strong score to go out on. So even though there wasn't a thematic reason for me to immediately replay it, I still did, because it was something that I felt I wanted to experience again. I can't put words to it, but I sat down and I think I beat it in one sitting the second time.
Oh, wow.
Because But
That's cool.
what is the reaction? How has that? I've seen a lot more cosplaying with Transistor than I did with Bastion. Now, don't get me wrong, I saw a lot of Kid and a lot of Zia, a lot of Rux, but I feel like Red and the cast of Transistor have really, really jumped out in terms of cosplaying and fan art. Do you see them being relatively similar, or?
Between Bastion and uh, you mean between Bastion and Transistor?
Yes.
Like, it's funny. Like my experience of it has been, um, like it's strange to talk about because when Transistor came out, I was not sure. Like, I feel like more people like Transistor more now than they did when it came out, but I felt similarly about Bastion, where when it first came out, like it got really good reviews and stuff. Like
Hmm.
by the measure of on average, it got really good reviews, but then it won a ton of awards. It won more it won more awards at the end of the year than the reviews would lead you to believe, because it got
Hmm.
like, it got like 80 range review scores, which is like
Hmm.
a lot of games get that. So I was really surprised and taken aback at how Bastion started racking up these awards months later. And
Hmm.
then we started seeing cosplay and all this kind of stuff, and we're like, wow, this game kind of stuck. And I think kind of a similar thing. So when we first revealed Transistor, which was about a year before it launched,
Hmm.
I think Red's design and the Transistor's design definitely had an immediate. I think it got a big reaction, which was really exciting, and for us to see in a big relief. We still had to finish the game and everything, but as for like which, I don't know which game got like more cosplay than the other. It's possible that Transistor is just sort of like easier to cosplay because maybe not making the Transistor itself, but
Right.
the characters look relatively more. It has more of a modern look to it. It's
Mm.
meant to have like the anachronistic kind of, if it's in the future, it's not necessarily in the distant future. Characters are dressed almost more like the early 20th century sooner than the distant future or something like that. But cosplay and fan art and that kind of stuff is some of the highest. It's some of the highest form of flattery, really, when you're working on a game. You see how much the world and the characters you've contributed to, how much of an impact that they've had on others, expressed in that way. There's like
Hmm.
music covers, fan fiction. Like when our games inspire people to create stuff, it's really really um, it's very gratifying. Because I think on a personal level, it's gratifying because that's to tie back to the very start of this conversation. That's like that's my background of like playing so many games. I'm like, I got to do something with this. Start writing about them. So it's cool that our games have been able to do that for others.
Well, speaking of writing, that's a good opportunity to transition on to your next game, Pyre. And I really wanted to talk about this because Pyre, again, started out in a way where I thought this doesn't play like any of the other games previous to this. I'm not sure how I'm going to like this. But then I saw a lot of similarities on purpose. For example, one of the ones that jumped out at me was I had my team that I really like to use in Pyre, but then similar to how in Transistor you were punished if you died while you had a function equipped. If you used somebody in your team for too long, you couldn't use them in an upcoming match, which forced you to try different combinations of people. And another thing was the combination of the gameplay versus a very passionate story that wanted to be told. It really jumped out at me that they were introducing so many characters on the front end, and there was a world that was being built very aggressively with a lot of ideas behind it. And it was set in such a different setting than your previous game that I was immediately interested in why some of these characters had horns, why were we in a semi-penal colony,
Yeah.
and one of the characters, and this is the one that I always bring up because I personally have a problem with the culture that's being encouraged with achievements, because I feel like that makes people go towards certain outcomes without a idea of what they want to do.
Yeah.
So through the entire game, you have the spirit in your orb, Sandra, who is
Yeah.
giving you assistance. And I really loved how you organically interacted with her, because she starts off standoffish and kind of sassy, then she starts gradually opening up to you. And at the end of the game, she gives you the choice. She asks you, she doesn't give you the choice. She asks you to please take her along with you because of the bond that you've grown. And because of the interaction there, I obviously was going to take her along. And maybe the most meaningful game thing in a game that I had played that year was when you take her orb, you put it in your pocket, and no achievement pops.
Oh yeah.
That felt like an emotional payoff to me.
Yeah, thank you. That's really so. That was cool to hear for a couple of reasons. So I'm really glad Sandra stood out. She was an important character to me. And the that may be the first time I've received such a generous compliment on for something we didn't do, of like, not having an achievement. But it's good. I appreciate that you observed that, because we did talk about. We were very conscious of that. Actually, I hope we tried to be working on Pyre. It's for very similar reasons. I think there's an achievement, I believe, for prevailing in one of the liberation rites.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, there's very, very little in the way. The achievements in that game are not about. It's not a game about winning, like spoilers.
Right.
It's a game about the journey of going through that type of experience that has kind of a zero-sum game at the heart of it. The idea that if you and I are in competition, if I win, you lose, and if you win, I lose. And what is that? And what happens in a system like that? So we wanted players to be able to go through Pyre and have an experience that's like very true to themselves. And kind of accepting their wins and losses along the way. So one of the really big challenges of that project is that there is no game over state, and the story moves forward no matter what. And I'm sure that many players don't experience it that way, because they have been conditioned from probably early childhood to only win, and to if they lose, they can restart. But in Pyre, you don't have to do that. You can accept your defeats and learn from them, and move on. And that's how it is in real life. Like, we don't get to load. I think one of the fantasies of video games is the ability to load a checkpoint and to try again until you get it right. Because in real life, we don't get second chances like we do in video games. So we wanted to have that be like one of the components of Pyre. And so it would have been really. We would have been really undermining ourselves to have like rewarded players for, you kicked their asses, achievement unlocked, like, because that's like not what the game is about at all, right? So yeah, I thank you for that.
And it was, so the idea you were saying, the idea that this is a game where losing is an acceptable outcome. There were a few times in the game that you explicitly made it a thing where the idea of losing might be the better idea. I know there were a couple liberation rites where you really sympathize with the opposing team. Now, there's some instances where it's like, no, this guy, I don't like him at all. He doesn't need to go back. But there's a couple instances where you go, well, maybe they should go home. And I did think it was fascinating, again, I guess spoiler, that the best ending came from you losing the final match. I thought that was fascinating. Now, this is best where you're assuming that the previous Nightwing sees what you are doing and why you're doing it, so they don't throw themselves to their death, which the first time I played it, that's the ending I got. I'm like, oh, this is dark. This is real dark.
Yeah. There are different there are versions where you could have also, after defeating him, you could have also given him his freedom to a different outcome. But it's a game with, we calculated it. It turns out that there are hundreds of millions of different possible ending permutations in Pyre. But yeah, we wanted, so that was that was a fun writing challenge to make that possible. But yeah, it was just really important that the story play out in a way that seemed true to what the characters would do in those situations. And we meant for it to be what you described is one of the darkest moments that happens in that game. But it really seemed like the only plausible outcome for that character, given the set of circumstances that he would have been defeated in that way again, and once again sort of denied his chance at freedom that he felt he rightfully deserved. And in fact, I see it as a moment for him. It's a moment of agency. He has no power over this anymore, but he has power over what happens next to him. And previously he had been pushed off of this mountain, and this time he goes voluntarily. But you know, I love that character a lot. I love a lot of the characters we've worked on, but he has some of the most, hopefully in the other kind of version of the ending that you played, you know, that felt satisfying in its own right. There are many outcomes for him that I think all hopefully end in a satisfying way, if not always in a happy way. So it was really fun to have a game where like we got to have the epilogue for every single character, kind of no matter the outcome.
The other ending I got definitely felt more empathetic. It felt more in line with what I was trying to accomplish while playing it. So it did feel this unexpected loss right in the tail end when I had been doing so well prior to this point. And like you said, with the zero sum, it was empowering playing through the game, knowing that as I was going to be playing, my team was going to be shrinking, but in a way that was ultimately furthering my goal. So one of the most harrowing things was when you found out the stars are going out. So you nailed the idea of creating a sense of urgency there without actually knowing what the outcome was going to be. And everything just kind of got darker from that point on, literally and figuratively.
Yeah. The idea that, you know, it's we knew, like, for the game to have drama, like a sense of weight to it, it had to, the choices around those liberation rights had to matter. If you could have just kind of grinded it out forever until everybody was free and happy and everything was fine, it would have been, again, I think, like antithetical to what the story of the game, like the experience that hopefully is somewhat true to life despite the fantastic trappings of the world, the experience it was trying to create, that like life is filled with these kind of messy decisions that we have to make in order to get to where we need to go. Pyre was a challenging game to work on, and it was like, it was our biggest kind of like, all of our games have been challenging to work on. It was our biggest, I think it's our biggest kind of departure. If Bastion and Transistor started to plot a trajectory for us, I think Pyre is even more unexpected. But it was really, I'm really glad I got to, it was like the biggest writing challenge of my life for sure, and I'm really I was really pleased with the response that it ended up getting from players. They're you know, hearing from folks like you, where I think it did have that impact for them, and they grew close to characters like Sandra, or you name it, and so it mattered to them what happened to them. So we wanted to make this game where you could, like, where you felt like you were on this big fantasy road trip, as it were, and then you could like get closer to these characters and really start to care about what happened to them, and then be able to have some influence over that. So yeah, that was our big, you know, I'm glad we got to make it. It's one of those games where, like, I think if we didn't make that game, I don't know that anybody would have. You know, it's not really in any traditional genre or anything like that. People call it like a sports game, visual novel. Or, it was tougher to it wasn't as easy to explain as, not that any of our games have been, but I'm glad people were able to have a unique experience with it.
If somebody had told me that one of the most emotionally engaging games was a fantasy space jam with a heavy narration, I would have went, I'm not sure I believe it. It's made by Supergiant. I'm listening. So that was
Thank
pretty
you.
much my experience with it. That being said, we don't have much time left, so I would like to talk about Hades just momentarily because I
Yeah.
know this game hasn't been out long and you guys are taking a continuous development approach. Now, I'm in the Agile world myself, so it's fascinating to hear that this is the approach, the iterative approach where you're getting feedback, choosing what kind of feature you're going to deliver at the end of the next certain period. This
Yeah.
is kind of my wheelhouse, so I'm fascinated to hear about how that's going for you, how the iterative feedback is going.
Yeah, it's going like so far so good. It's been an exciting ride. Yeah, Hades, starting with our announcement, because with our previous games we announced them about a year give or take before the launch. But with Hades, we announced and launched the game into early access in the same moment
Mm-hmm.
on December 6th, just some weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
And so now we've gone and as part of that, we announced that we're gonna keep building the game in early access, have these major updates on pretty much a monthly cadence. So our first one was in mid-January, and we're less than 2 weeks away from our second one. And the first major update was really exciting. It it did everything that we hoped for. It got a ton of players to come back to the game. It reignited their excitement around it. It continued the story of the game in some cool ways and added new dimension to the world. Like part of what we were excited with, the idea of making an early access game was at the core of why we made this game at all. It's
Mm-hmm.
why we could have. It's why we chose every decision about the game from the theme on down stemmed from wanting it to be the sort of game that we could put out there in this initial form and then keep building, taking community feedback into account along the way. We felt, fundamentally that it would make it a better game at the end.
Mm-hmm.
But it also opened up so many new and exciting design challenges for us and narrative opportunities as well. Like really similar, because we've talked about all our games now.
Mm-hmm.
One of just like with Bastion, when we looked at the action RPG and said, there's an opportunity to put some story into one of these games. Why don't we try that? Because maybe
Right.
we could distinguish ourselves that way.
Mm-hmm.
We felt pretty similarly when we looked at the roguelike this time around. So roguelike games, or roguelite as some people call them, are games where you kind of you play, you die, you start again, and aspects of the world are different and they're designed around replayability. So we
Mm-hmm.
were really interested in that kind of replayable design, but in seeing if we could add a forward-moving narrative onto it, where there is narrative continuity, there's characters, all the good stuff that we did with a bigger cast of characters on Pyre. Except now they're fully voiced. You can walk up and talk to them. All this kind of good stuff, and it combines, we think, the best aspects of it. Has the kind of the combinatorial richness of Transistor, where you can mix and match different abilities and
Mm-hmm.
thousands of different combinations, but it has the pick up and play appeal of Bastion. So for us, it was kind of almost just the best stuff we think we've learned, the stuff we have enjoyed working on the most over the years. Can we make a whole game around that while also giving us this chance to keep building it over time instead of just jamming it all in to the one initial release and then kind of not doing anything with it
Mm-hmm.
again, because our games, as you've experienced, our endings don't necessarily leave obvious room for a continuation. So whereas with Hades, with the setting being what it is, the Greek underworld, and
Right.
having access to this entire pantheon that we could spin in our own way, and there's so many things that we could build onto this world while still
Mm-hmm.
having it feel relatively complete for what it is along the way. So it's been really fun. We're getting great feedback and great support from players. It's definitely an adjustment that we're getting used to, which is something that we fully expected. because we've been more used to building games, in relative solitude. And now we can get more real-time feedback from a lot more people. But it means, I think, that we've got our work cut out for us for a long time to come, and we can approach our decisions, I think, with even more confidence in a lot of ways than we have in the past, when we could sometimes get lost in the weeds, working on like prototyping a game like Pyre or Transistor, not really knowing if our ideas are coming together. Now we can put something out there and people will let us know what's promising about it, what's not working about it, and that gives us a really good foundation to work from and keep making the game better.
Well, that's all. It's been fascinating to read the development because, for the sake of transparency, my computer runs like a potato. So while I can follow the development updates, unfortunately, I really can't play the game because I just have a sad little laptop from 4 years ago, so it doesn't work super great. But I have been listening to the soundtrack. I've been reading the development blog updates. I've been doing what I can. But I'm anxiously, I think shortly after it launched, you said you anticipated to be in early access for approximately 2 years. So
it's more like we said at least a year. Yeah, we don't know. I don't know. 2 years. So, oh no. But at least I think this year at least, we will be in early access, and then next 2 years is farther away than I can count. In this day and age, but we certainly will be keeping busy with it for a while. And folks who have enjoyed our games in the past, from being able to get something that's like fully complete, and of course they could always come to it when early access is complete, and it'll be done probably on a similar timeline to our last couple of games, all told, because it's only been we announced and launched Hades only like a year and 3 months or something after we had launched Pyre. So we got busy pretty quick after Pyre was done on this one, and we were so excited to work on it.
Oh yes, it's when I saw it was going to be a roguelike game, a genre I have a lot of enthusiasm for, combined with you guys' next outing, I really wished I had a better PC.
Oh, cool. So yeah, well, I hope you get to try it someday. Yeah,
I will do my best. That being said, I have taken up more of your time than I intended. So, is there anything else you would like to add before we wrap this up?
Oh, just to thank you again for having me on, and for folks watching or listening. Yeah, thanks so much for your support. It really, for me, it's just hearing from our players. For me, is very much a driving motivation over the years to do the best we can to make stuff that is worth your time. So keep holding us to a high standard, and keep letting us know what you think. That's like all, as a game developer, that's really all you can hope for, I think, is to have folks playing your stuff and letting you know. So thank you very much for all your thoughts during this conversation.
Well, thank you tremendously for everything that you do and will continue to do. Thank you tremendously again. I hope you have a good evening, and yes.
Thank you. Yeah, take care. I'm glad we got a chance to talk.
Yes,
have
thank
a
you
good
very
night
much.
Too.
You
Bye.
too. Bye.
Did you play any of Supergiant's games? What did you think of Bastion? Did you like how Transistor changed when it came out? What about Pyre? Did you enjoy the rapid departure from the previous games? Have you enjoyed Hades? Let us know. But until next time, this has been Indie Thoughts on Co-Opinions.